Agatha Raisin and the Pudding Poison. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's mystery. Agatha Raisin never expected a quiet afternoon tea to turn deadly. As the final spoonful of the village pudding is served, someone collapses, gasping. Calm, yet keenly observant, Agatha notices the subtle signs others overlook: tiny crumbs, nervous glances, and a lingering scent of almonds that hint at a sinister secret. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop your answer in the comments. I always enjoy learning more about our wonderful community. And do not forget to like and subscribe. It will motivate me for more mysteries every day. Now, let's get cozy and begin tonight's story.
Chapter 1. A Village Celebration. Agatha Raisin adjusted her crimson scarf and stepped on to the worn stone path leading to Carsley Village Hall. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves, mingling with the unmistakable scent of baking wafting from inside. She paused a moment to take in the sight. Colorful bunting swayed gently from the high windows, pumpkins and gourds arranged artfully on each sill, and a scattering of chrysanthemums provided vibrant splashes of autumnal gold and crimson. The village hall, a modest brick building with friendly, sloping roof lines, seemed to glow with warmth against the pale afternoon sky. Inside, the hall buzzed with life. Laughter rose in gentle waves over the chatter of neighbors greeting one another, the clink of fine china, and the occasional squeak of chairs on polished wooden floors. Agatha's eyes roamed, noting familiar faces. There was Mrs. Pritchard, fussing over a plate of scones, carefully aligning each one with almost military precision, while Mr. Larkins debated, loudly but good-naturedly, the proper method for whipping cream. Children darted between tables, cheeks flushed with excitement, their parents casting intermittent glances to ensure no catastrophe occurred. Agatha's lips curved into a knowing smile. The village's annual harvest tea was exactly as it should be: slightly chaotic, gently amusing, and entirely endearing. She made her way to a side table, where a selection of homemade pies and tarts was displayed. Her attention, however, was drawn immediately to the centerpiece, the Carsley pudding. Tall, round, and crowned with a delicate lattice of sponge sugar, it had an air of eccentricity that seemed to embody the village itself. Agatha leaned in slightly, inhaling the faintly nutty aroma that hinted at almonds, a detail she made a mental note of, though her curiosity was not yet fully piqued. She could already imagine the whispers that would accompany its eventual slicing, the playful rivalries over who had contributed the best pudding in years past. As she moved through the crowd, Agatha observed small, telling gestures. Mr. Henshaw, typically jovial, seemed tense as he lingered near the dessert table, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. Across the room, Mrs. Tilling waved cheerfully at passers-by, though her hand trembled ever so slightly as she poured tea for a guest. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible tension threading through the hall, easily dismissed by anyone not paying close attention, but Agatha, naturally observant, noted it instantly. The warmth of the gathering wrapped around her, but her mind remained alert. She watched villagers gossiping in clusters, offering exaggerated praise for the pastries, yet with glances that hinted at unspoken grudges. Mr. Larkin's debate about cream consistency took a sudden sharp turn into a discussion about the proper recipe for the pudding, and Agatha caught the tiniest flash of annoyance cross the face of Mrs. Pritchard, who clearly believed she held the undisputed secret. Children's laughter punctuated the scene, chasing away any creeping suspicion, and Agatha allowed herself a moment of genuine amusement as one small boy accidentally knocked over a plate of biscuits, prompting a flurry of apologies and chuckles. Even amidst the minor chaos, The hall exuded a cozy charm, the smell of baked goods, the soft hum of conversation, and the rich tapestry of faces that had known one another for decades. With a final glance at the towering pudding, Agatha noted that Mr. Henshaw was still hovering nearby, eyes darting toward it as if guarding it, or perhaps just waiting for the right moment. It was a minor curiosity, nothing overtly alarming, yet enough to prick her instincts. As she accepted a cup of steaming tea from a kindly neighbor, she felt that gentle tug of anticipation, the sense that, beneath the warm, familiar surface, there might be stories, and perhaps secrets, waiting to be discovered. And so, amidst the comforting aromas and cheerful chatter of Carsley Village Hall, Agatha Raisin began her careful observation, sipping her tea, smiling quietly, and letting her sharp eyes take in every detail, every subtle glance, and every whispered word.
Agatha had just settled into a corner of the hall with her tea when a low, almost conspiratorial murmur caught her attention. She leaned subtly toward the source. Mrs. Gable, a matronly figure known for her love of gossip, was speaking in hushed tones to a neighbor, her eyes darting as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They say the pudding recipe is worth more than the prize itself," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice a mixture of amusement and warning. "Old rivalries, secret ingredients. Some say it's practically a family heirloom." Agatha arched an eyebrow, savoring the delicate steam curling from her teacup. She made a mental note. Whenever a community treats a dessert as a battleground, trouble often follows, though, of course, in a way that keeps the village charming rather than frightening. Still, she found herself scanning the room with renewed curiosity. There was a subtle energy now, an undercurrent beneath the laughter and polite chatter, as if everyone were holding back a secret just to see who would notice. Her gaze fell on the hostess, Mrs. Tilling, who moved from table to table with a forced cheerfulness that did little to mask the nervous twitch in her wrist. Every so often she would glance at the pudding with a kind of anxious affection, as though daring anyone to lay a finger on it without consequence. Agatha's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. The hall was a theater of politeness, but she could read the script beneath it. Careful eyes, hushed conversations, subtle rivalries, and someone waiting for just the right moment to act. From her vantage point, she observed Mr. Henshaw again. He lingered at the dessert table with an intensity that was almost comical if it weren't mildly suspicious. He rearranged a tray of tarts for the third time, muttering something about symmetry, yet each movement seemed deliberate, almost performative. Agatha considered whether he was protecting the pudding or merely protecting his own ego. Villagers passed him with exaggerated politeness, sidestepping him like one might a particularly enthusiastic hedge, and Agatha's amusement at the choreography was tinged with curiosity. Then there was the minor chaos of the afternoon, a teacup tipped by a careless child, a scone sliding perilously close to the edge of the table, and a dropped sugar spoon that clattered against the plate with a startling clink. Each incident was inconsequential on its own, but together they painted a picture of a hall brimming with tiny tensions. Agatha's mind worked methodically, cataloging patterns and contradictions. Was it merely clumsiness? Or was someone engineering these little disturbances to gauge reactions? She allowed herself a small internal chuckle at the idea. Village theatrics, exaggerated for dramatic effect, yet perhaps concealing something worth noticing. Her attention shifted as a stranger appeared at the far end of the hall, a man she did not recognize. He was tall, with an overcoat that seemed slightly out of place among the casual autumn attire of villagers. His eyes scanned the room with a quiet calculation, lingering briefly on the pudding before moving on. Agatha tilted her head slightly, observing him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. He did not engage with anyone, yet his presence was like a single discordant note in any otherwise harmonious melody. Even as she sipped her tea, Her thoughts danced between amusement and anticipation. Every glance, every tremor of a hand, every whispered comment became a clue to the social undercurrents of Carsley Village. The playful rivalries and eccentricities that had seemed harmless moments ago now hinted at deeper stories beneath the surface. And as always, Agatha's sharp mind delighted in connecting dots no one else seemed to notice. By the time the next round of biscuits was served, she had catalogued enough oddities to keep her occupied for the afternoon. Secret recipes, hidden grudges, a nervous hostess, and a mysterious outsider. The hall seemed to thrum with subtle intrigue. Agatha leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the room settle around her, all while her mind quietly prepared for the investigation she knew would soon begin.
Chapter 2. The Fatal Dessert. At last, the moment everyone had been anticipating arrived. With a flourish, Mrs. Tilling lifted the cover from the Carsley pudding, revealing its glistening surface crowned with spun sugar that caught the light like tiny golden threads. The hall seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat. Children squealed with delight. Elders nodded approvingly. And even the perpetually skeptical Mr. Larkins allowed a faint smile to cross his usually stern face. Agatha's own eyes danced over the dessert, noting the careful lattice work, the subtle hint of nutmeg in the aroma, and the faint almond undertone that had drawn her curiosity earlier. As the first slice was cut and plated, a ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. Villagers leaned forward eagerly, fingers twitching in anticipation, voices buzzing with polite chatter and playful comments. "I do hope my contribution wasn't too sweet," Mrs. Pritchard said, offering a nervous smile to her neighbors. Mr. Henshaw, however, lingered near the table, eyes darting from slice to slice, as if each morsel were a miniature treasure he had to monitor personally. Agatha observed him with quiet amusement, noting the subtle tension in his posture and the way his hands twitched just slightly whenever someone reached for the pudding. It was then that she caught a tiny discrepancy. One serving spoon, gleaming silver and slightly out of place, had been set just a little too far forward, almost as if someone had been in a rush or trying to draw attention. A faint scent of almonds, sharper than usual, lingered in the air. Agatha's mind ticked, cataloguing these small but peculiar details, while the villagers, oblivious to the minor oddities, began tasting the pudding. The first bites were met with appreciative murmurs. "Delicious! Exquisite! Quite the triumph!" Agatha noted each reaction as the chatter and clinking of cutlery created a lively backdrop to the unfolding scene. Yet her attention was not entirely on the flavor. She scanned the hall, observing minor gestures, a slight hesitation before swallowing, the way one guest's eyes flicked nervously toward the stranger at the back of the hall, the subtle tightening of a jaw here and a fleeting shiver there. Then came the moment that shattered the calm. A sudden gasp drew the room's attention, and a guest clutched their throat, staggering back from the table. Chairs scraped across the floor, a tray of biscuits toppled, and a hush of panic rippled through the hall. Children screamed, though some merely from surprise, and neighbors rushed forward, hands flailing as they tried to assist. Agatha, remaining composed, stepped forward with deliberate calm, noting every detail: the guest's reddening face, the slight tremor in their hands, and the panicked confusion that spread among bystanders. Voices overlapped, questions, exclamations, calls for water, but Agatha's eyes were sharp, her mind observing patterns others could not see. Mr. Henshaw froze near the dessert table, his expression a mixture of shock and fear, while the stranger at the back of the hall appeared uncomfortably still, watching the chaos with a measured, almost clinical interest.
The aroma of the pudding, once warm and inviting, now carried a faintly acrid note, subtle but unsettling to Agatha's keen senses. Amid the flurry, Agatha catalogued each minor detail with her characteristic precision. A child had knocked over a sugar bowl in the scramble, but not enough to cause harm. A plate of tarts had slid slightly, revealing a slice missing an unexpected garnish. Everything seemed small, almost trivial, but Agatha's intuition hummed. Something in the pudding itself had caused this sudden collapse. By the time the local doctor arrived, gently pushing past panicked villagers, the hall had transformed. The once cozy gathering now hummed with tension. Yet Agatha stood apart, composed and quietly observant. Her sharp gaze swept from table to table, from trembling hands to darting eyes, cataloguing the scene for clues invisible to anyone else. While neighbors whispered in alarm, Agatha already began the mental framework for the investigation that was about to unfold.
The hall had descended into controlled chaos. Villagers crowded around the collapsed guest, their expressions a mixture of alarm, confusion, and helplessness. Chairs were shuffled aside, voices rose and fell in anxious bursts, and the sharp scent of spilled tea mingled with the lingering aroma of the now infamous Carsley pudding. Agatha, however, remained calm, her eyes scanning the room with quiet precision, noting every minor detail that might escape the panicked crowd. Crumbs dotted the floor near the dessert table, some pressed into the edge of the rug where they shouldn't have been. Agatha's gaze lingered on the small silver teaspoon that had been missing from its usual place on the serving tray. It was subtle, almost trivial, yet in a room where every movement was recorded by her observant mind, the absent utensil felt deliberate. She tucked the detail away, knowing it could be more significant than anyone realized. Neighbors fussed over the victim, flapping their hands, offering towels, and muttering prayers, while children peeked from behind skirts, wide-eyed and uncertain. The local doctor, a rotund man with an ever-present frown, pushed through the throng. "Stand back, everyone," he commanded gently but firmly. He knelt beside the guest, taking a quick pulse, and his frown deepened. "I'm afraid this is poisoning," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. The announcement sent a ripple through the hall. Gasps and exclamations collided, while several villagers whispered among themselves, glancing at one another with suspicion. Agatha's lips pressed together in a thin line of concentration. She observed body language, subtle shifts in stance, nervous hand-wringing, and faces suddenly flushing under the scrutiny of anxious neighbors. Patterns began to emerge. Who lingered too long near the pudding? Who avoided eye contact? Who seemed genuinely concerned versus theatrically shocked? Mr. Henshaw, still close to the dessert table, straightened his back and cleared his throat, attempting to look composed, though his hands shook slightly. Across the room, Mrs. Pritchard muttered something about careless children, but her eyes flicked constantly to her own tray of baked goods, as if calculating their safety, or perhaps their potential as evidence. The subtle rivalries Agatha had noticed earlier were now illuminated by stress, each person's quirks magnified in response to the crisis. Agatha's gaze swept past them all to the mysterious visitor at the rear of the hall. He had remained remarkably still, observing with what seemed a deliberate detachment, his expression unreadable. She made a mental note of his posture, his gloved hands, and the faint smudge on his overcoat, details that might reveal more if examined carefully. His presence added another layer of intrigue. A stranger in a tight-knit village was bound to attract suspicion, though Agatha knew better than to jump to conclusions without evidence. Small things drew her attention, even as chaos swirled around her.
A faint smear of pudding on the edge of a plate, a teaspoon misplaced atop a napkin rather than beside it, a slight discoloration in one portion of the dessert that no one else seemed to notice. Each minor inconsistency was catalogued with meticulous care, forming the beginnings of a mental map of the scene. To Agatha, these details whispered possibilities. Someone had tampered, whether deliberately or accidentally, and the clues were scattered for anyone observant enough to see them. As the doctor stabilized the guest and arranged for immediate care, villagers gathered in tight-knit clusters, discussing motives in hushed, anxious tones. Who might wish harm upon the victim? Who had access to the dessert beforehand? Every whispered theory seemed plausible, every glance charged with speculation. Agatha listened with polite attentiveness, nodding occasionally, while quietly assembling the network of suspicions, quirks, and rivalries that could point toward the culprit. By the time the commotion began to settle, the hall retained the echo of panic. Yet Agatha's mind was already several steps ahead. Each crumb, each subtle gesture, each nervous twitch had been observed and filed away. Beneath the chaos, a pattern was forming, and Agatha Raisin, as ever, was ready to follow it wherever it might lead.
Chapter 3. The investigation begins. By mid-morning, the village hall had regained a fragile calm. Chairs were shuffled back into place, spilled tea cleaned up, and the faint scent of burnt sugar from the toppled tray had dissipated. Villagers huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, casting occasional glances at the covered dessert as if it might spring to life again. Agatha, unruffled amid the mild chaos, set about her quiet investigation, notebook discreetly tucked into her handbag. Her first task was to speak with those closest to the pudding. She approached Mrs. Tilling, the hostess, who clutched her apron with both hands, eyes wide and lips pressed together. "Tell me exactly who touched it before it was served," Agatha prompted gently, her tone conversational yet sharp. Mrs. Tilling began a rapid account, herself, Mr. Henshaw adjusting the sugar lattice, Mrs. Pritchard whisking cream, and an occasional nervous glance toward a tray she had entrusted to a helper. Agatha nodded, noting every detail, the timing of movements, and subtle hesitations that suggested either forgetfulness or carefully concealed truths. Moving through the hall, she observed minor inconsistencies. Mr. Henshaw claimed he had only arranged the desserts neatly, yet his hands were dusted with a faint residue of cinnamon. Mrs. Pritchard insisted she had only touched her scones, though a small smear of almond appeared suspiciously on her sleeve. Villagers around them offered unrequested commentary, each revealing contradictions through casual observations. Agatha suppressed a small smile. Villages thrived on gossip and embellishment, and such minor exaggerations often pointed directly to hidden truths. Next, she turned her attention to the ingredients themselves. The pudding, once removed from its ornate cover, had cooled slightly, but Agatha inspected it meticulously. Layers of custard, fruit, and a delicate almond sponge were visible, each element carefully prepared. She noted that only a few individuals had access to the mixing bowls, utensils, and the secret blend of spices. The lattice sugar topping, though seemingly innocuous, could be easily manipulated to conceal something unusual, an observation she filed mentally. Even the tiniest detail might prove decisive in understanding how the poisoning occurred. As she conducted her inquiry, Agatha engaged the villagers with light, pointed questions that encouraged them to reveal information without realizing it. A child, tugging at her skirt, volunteered that Mr. Henshaw had been watching the pudding too much, which elicited nervous laughter from adults but subtly confirmed earlier suspicions. Mrs. Tilling, in her anxiety, admitted to borrowing a teaspoon from another tray, a minor detail that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, but now seemed potentially significant. Amid this subtle sleuthing, Humor quietly softened the tension. Mr. Larkins, ever dramatic, demonstrated how he might have accidentally spilled custard, wobbling his shoulders and nearly toppling his own cup of tea. The resulting laughter was light, yet Agatha noted how some villagers stiffened at the joke, their reactions telling her more than words ever could. Each awkward pause, fidget, or nervous glance became a piece of the puzzle that would guide her next steps. As she sipped her tea, carefully observing the assembly of nervous and curious villagers, Agatha's sharp mind pieced together preliminary theories. The pattern was emerging slowly but unmistakably, and though the culprit remained hidden, the threads of suspicion were now firmly in her hands. With humor, precision, and patience, she was already several steps ahead, quietly orchestrating the first moves in what promised to be a delicate investigation.
The kitchen, tucked behind the hall with its creaking wooden door, held the quiet scent of vanilla, citrus, and lingering almond from the earlier baking frenzy. Agatha pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, careful not to draw attention. Sunlight filtered through a small window, casting a golden glow on counters stacked with mixing bowls, utensils, and half-empty jars of ingredients. The room was familiar, yet transformed by the absence of its usual bustle. An air of quiet anticipation hung, like the pause before a storm. Agatha moved methodically, scanning each surface and cupboard. Her eyes immediately caught a subtle inconsistency. The jar of powdered sugar was nearly empty, despite only a fraction being used for the pudding. A faint smudge of cocoa on the counter, slightly out of place, suggested hurried or distracted handling. She tapped a finger lightly on a mixing bowl, noting a faint residue of something slightly bitter to the touch. A trace small enough for anyone else to overlook, but telling to someone observant. The utensils told their own story. A spoon was missing entirely, while another lay slightly askew, not where it should have been, and a faint streak of almond paste marked the edge of a tray. Agatha crouched to examine the floor, spotting crumbs leading toward the corner where a small basket of extra ingredients had been stowed. Her mind ticked through possibilities. Each anomaly was minor, yet together they painted a picture of someone moving with purpose, handling the pudding with more intent than any mere clumsiness would explain. Her attention turned to notes left on the counter, handwritten reminders of preparation steps and ingredient ratios. One note, in Mrs. Tilling's neat script, contained an unusual addition, a specific instruction for a pinch of nutmeg, repeated twice. Agatha's eyebrows lifted. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, almost as if emphasizing the step to ensure someone noticed, or perhaps to mask the real tampering. She jotted the detail in her mind, weighing its significance. A faint creak from the door made her glance up. A child, peeking in with curiosity, froze when their eyes met hers. Agatha offered a gentle smile and a subtle wave, dismissing any suspicion, though she noted the child's fascination with Mr. Henshaw's meticulous arrangements earlier. Even in small observers, clues often hid, tucked between innocent curiosity and unconscious mimicry of adult behaviors. Agatha moved to the spice rack, inspecting jars of cinnamon, cloves, and allspice. Nothing seemed amiss, yet a tiny disturbance, a jar slightly out of line with the others, caught her eye. She nudged it gently and noticed the faint residue on the counter beneath it. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet its placement suggested that someone had been in a hurry or deliberately avoiding detection. Her sharp mind catalogued every observation, connecting the movements, residues, and inconsistencies into a tentative narrative. Even in this quiet space, humor and village eccentricities peeked through. A note scribbled on the fridge warned, "Do not touch the lemon zest unless you are brave," a warning obviously written in jest, but a reflection of the playful character of Carsley villagers. Agatha allowed herself a small smile, the combination of seriousness and whimsy perfectly encapsulating the world she navigated. By the time she exited the kitchen, Agatha's mental map of the scene had expanded considerably. Missing ingredients, displaced utensils, subtle residues, and carefully written notes suggested deliberate interference.
She returned to the hall, her demeanor calm but alert, already formulating the next phase of her investigation. Each tiny detail she had uncovered added depth to the mystery, and she knew that somewhere among the bustling villagers the truth waited patiently to be revealed.
Chapter 4. Suspicions Arise. Agatha settled into a corner of the hall, notebook at the ready, as the villagers began to recover from the morning's dramatic episode. She had already noted minor inconsistencies and subtle tensions, but now it was time to dig deeper through conversation. One by one, she approached potential suspects, her keen eyes and gentle demeanor coaxing details that others might overlook. Her first interview was with Mr. Henshaw, who immediately straightened his posture, a faint blush rising in his cheeks. I merely arranged the desserts," he stammered, voice slightly higher than usual. Agatha arched an eyebrow, noting the dusting of cinnamon on his cuff that contradicted his account. "Of course," she murmured, letting her words hang. "Yet somehow the spoon you claimed never to touch is missing. Curious, isn't it?" His flustered expression suggested that he knew more than he admitted, or perhaps was simply guilty of an unguarded moment of vanity. Next, she approached Mrs. Pritchard, who was fussing with a napkin, twitching her fingers nervously. "I only touched my scones," she insisted, though her sleeve bore a faint smear of almond paste. Agatha smiled politely. "Indeed, but you also inspected the pudding, did you not? I hear that a touch can make all the difference in texture." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened, her protestations mingling with a faint blush that was almost comical in its intensity. Between interviews, Agatha paused to observe the hall. Mrs. Tilling hovered nervously near the refreshment table, occasionally muttering reminders about ingredient lists, while a cluster of villagers whispered near the far window, eyes darting toward the stranger who had remained quiet and alert throughout the morning. Agatha noted the interplay of glances and gestures, small clues embedded in casual movement. A brief conversation with Mrs. Gable revealed more layers. "I only peeked while fetching the cream," she said, smiling innocently, though her words carried an undertone of mischief. "But I did notice Mr. Larkins hovering near the sugar lattice for longer than one should, don't you think?" Agatha jotted the detail down, appreciating the mixture of earnest observation and village gossip. It was a reminder that information often came draped in personality quirks, requiring careful untangling. Even light-hearted moments offered insight. A child piped up, claiming that Mr. Henshaw sniffed the pudding 3 times before it was served. Laughter rippled through the group, yet Agatha's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Humor, after all, often masked embarrassment or guilt. Subtle contradictions, faint hesitations, and slips of tongue were far more revealing than overt confessions. As she moved through the room, Agatha pieced together emerging narratives: secret rivalries over the prized recipe, small crushes that made certain villagers unusually attentive, and long-standing grudges that surfaced in fleeting glances and carefully chosen words. A seemingly casual remark, "I merely adjusted the lattice for symmetry," could be interpreted in multiple ways when examined against context, timing, and body language. Each interview became a tiny puzzle piece, the overall image forming slowly but unmistakably. By late afternoon, Agatha had collected a network of statements, observations, and subtle contradictions. Every whisper, twitch, and blush was catalogued in her mind, creating a mental map of possible motives and opportunities. Even casual dialogue offered clues, whether a careless joke, an inadvertent slip, or a faint hesitation, and she stored each detail for later comparison. With a final sip of tea, Agatha leaned back, surveying the hall. The villagers chatted cautiously now, aware of her quiet scrutiny, yet unaware of how much she had already deduced. Patterns were emerging, connections taking shape, and the network of suspicion grew richer with each exchange. To any casual observer, it was merely a series of friendly interviews, but to Agatha, it was the careful weaving of threads that might ultimately reveal the culprit. As the afternoon sun slanted through the village hall windows, Agatha gathered her notes, ready to leave the main gathering to reflect in quiet solitude. But when she returned to her bag to retrieve a pen, a small folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages of her notebook. Frowning, she picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was angular, precise, and unfamiliar, elegant in a slightly menacing way. The words were few, but chilling. Stop poking into what you do not understand. Some secrets are better left buried. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line as her mind immediately began to dissect the message. It was not overtly threatening, yet the implication was clear. Someone had taken notice of her inquiries and disapproved. The handwriting suggested someone deliberate and composed, someone capable of subtle manipulation. She traced the letters with her fingertip, noting the faint smudge at the edge, as though the writer had been in a hurry or perhaps deliberately careless. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her notebook again. Despite the unease it caused, Agatha felt a surge of curiosity and determination. The cryptic warning only intensified her resolve. Someone in the village was attempting to obstruct her investigation, and she now had a personal stake in uncovering the truth. Her sharp mind immediately began to cross-reference the timing, the note's placement, and who had been near her bag during the earlier commotion. Wanting counsel and perspective, she sought out her trusted friend, Miss Hetty Farrow, who was known for her practicality and keen eye. Hetty was perched by the window, knitting needles poised in hand, a serene expression on her face that masked her natural curiosity. Agatha slid into the chair beside her and recounted the discovery. Hetty listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "Someone clearly doesn't want you looking too closely," she said softly, "but it could also be a prank or a test. Either way, caution is wise." The two women examined the note together. Hetty commented on the unusual phrasing, noting how the words "better left buried" implied knowledge of past events, perhaps even referencing long-standing rivalries or family secrets. Agatha nodded, thinking of the village's simmering tensions, old grudges, and the subtle feuds she had already observed among neighbors. The author of the note clearly knew something that most did not, and the precision of the handwriting suggested education and refinement, hinting at someone accustomed to control. As they discussed, Agatha's mind wandered to potential suspects. Mr. Henshaw, meticulous and easily flustered, might resent her interference. Mrs. Pritchard, anxious and secretive, could have a vested interest in the pudding's reputation. Even the stranger lingering at the edge of gatherings came to mind, his quiet observation potentially masking deeper involvement. Every villager, every fleeting glance, suddenly carried more weight in her analytical mind. Though the note was unsettling, it also provided an unexpected thrill, a cozy, suspenseful spark to the otherwise orderly afternoon. Agatha felt the familiar mix of caution and excitement that came with a new mystery. The puzzle was not just about food and gossip anymore. It had taken a decidedly personal turn. She and Hetty cataloged their observations, cross-referenced timing and movements, and made mental notes about how best to proceed. By the time the sunlight began to wane, Agatha returned the note to her bag, securing it with a sense of quiet determination. The cryptic warning had changed the stakes, heightened the suspense, and sharpened her focus. Whoever had left it underestimated her resolve. Agatha Raisin was never one to back down. The investigation, she knew, had only just begun, and the threads of secrecy, suspicion, and subtle danger were weaving together into a tapestry she intended to unravel.
Chapter 5. Uncovering Motives.
Agatha returned to the village hall with a renewed sense of purpose, her mind already tracing the threads of conversations, gestures, and minor oddities she had observed over the past 2 days. The room had quieted into an almost normal afternoon hum, with villagers sipping tea in small clusters and exchanging polite commentary about the morning's chaos. Yet beneath the chatter, Agatha sensed layers of tension, small currents of rivalry and jealousy that might explain more than anyone was willing to admit. Her first stop was near Mrs. Tilling, who fussed over the remaining pastries, a faint flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Agatha leaned in, casually asking about her relationship with the other bakers in town. "Oh, you know," Mrs. Tilling began, wringing her hands, "we all admire one another, but there are differences of opinion on methods, and the pudding, it's a proud tradition. Some might go to extreme lengths to ensure their own contribution shines." Agatha's mind ticked immediately. Extreme lengths, indeed. She noted the nervous glance Mrs. Tilling cast toward Mr. Henshaw, who was quietly straightening chairs, muttering something about symmetry. Moving through the room, Agatha overheard snippets of conversation that revealed past rivalries she had not fully understood. Mrs. Pritchard complained to a neighbor about a slight oversight years ago in the village bake-off, which had left her feeling slighted, while Mr. Larkins mentioned in passing how his family had once disputed the authenticity of a treasured recipe. Each fragment added depth to the puzzle, suggesting that the tensions surrounding the pudding were far from new. Agatha's gaze drifted to small domestic details, seemingly inconsequential, yet revealing character and opportunity. A tiny smear of almond paste on the edge of a chair, a tray slightly misaligned, a faint cinnamon dusting on the counter, all hinted at the meticulous care or slight carelessness with which villagers handled their culinary creations. Even the placement of a teacup, slightly askew, seemed to reflect the owner's personality, perhaps providing a subtle clue to intentions or habits. Humor softened the intensity of the discoveries. A child whispered to another that Mr. Henshaw practices the pudding dance every year, moving his hands over desserts with exaggerated care. The adults laughed, yet Agatha noted the truth behind the jest. Mr. Henshaw's obsessive attention to the latticework and toppings made him both endearing and suspicious in the context of the unfolding mystery. Unexpected alliances emerged as well. Mrs. Pritchard, who typically avoided Mr. Larkins, was seen quietly discussing the sugar lattice technique with him, their heads bent close in a way that suggested mutual interest in the technical perfection of their shared craft. Agatha filed the detail away. Cooperation between unlikely pairs might hide motives or reveal strategies, and it added a fresh layer to the web of suspicion she was untangling. Even seemingly minor grudges provided valuable context. Mrs. Tilling's subtle irritation when her advice about spice ratios was ignored by another baker indicated long-standing competition, while Mr. Larkin's barely concealed annoyance at someone borrowing his spoon suggested a protective, almost territorial attitude toward ingredients and tools. Every subtle reaction, every understated sigh, and every careful word created a mosaic of intent and opportunity. By the late afternoon, Agatha had mapped a network of motives, quirks, and historical disputes. Past slights, hidden jealousies, and secret alliances were now clear threads in the tapestry surrounding the pudding incident. Her mind synthesized the information with her characteristic precision, weighing humor against tension and minor domestic details against major possibilities. As she sipped her tea and observed the village hall, Agatha felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The picture was becoming clearer, though the culprit remained elusive. She understood the emotional landscape of Carsley's residence better now. The pride, the resentments, the rivalries, and even the gentle humor that underpinned their interactions. Each subtle revelation brought her closer to the truth, quietly drawing the tangled web into focus while maintaining the cozy charm that defined her world. Agatha returned to the now quiet kitchen, determined to reconstruct the sequence of events surrounding the pudding's preparation. She traced each step meticulously, starting with the initial mixing of ingredients. The flour, sugar, eggs, and almond paste had all been measured with care, yet she noticed subtle discrepancies in the markings on the jars. Powdered sugar slightly lower than expected, a faint smear of cocoa in an unusual place, a small smudge of nutmeg near the edge of the counter. Each tiny detail whispered possibilities. She pictured the timeline in her mind. Who had access to which ingredient at what moment, and for how long? Mrs. Tilling had begun the preparation early, assisted by Mr. Henshaw, who had hovered over the sugar lattice with exaggerated care. Mrs. Pritchard had been assigned the cream topping, yet her apron bore traces of almond, suggesting she might have touched more than she claimed. Agatha noted the child, who had peered curiously into the kitchen, speculating whether the small helper might have disturbed utensils or ingredients unknowingly. The missing teaspoon remained a focal point. Agatha replayed the morning in her mind, imagining the sequence of handoffs at the dessert table. Someone had moved it deliberately or carelessly, but in a way that allowed access to the pudding. The faint residue she had observed earlier suggested contact with an unusual substance, now critical in reconstructing the possible act of poisoning. Small inconsistencies in villagers' accounts gained new significance. Mr. Henshaw's insistence that he had only arranged the desserts now seemed evasive when compared to the traces of cinnamon on his cuff. Mrs. Pritchard's claim of limited involvement contradicted the almond smear on her sleeve. Even Mrs. Tilling's meticulous notes contained a repeated instruction for nutmeg, which might have drawn attention away from a subtler modification elsewhere in the pudding. Agatha catalogued each contradiction, seeing how minor deviations from truth could form an invisible roadmap to the culprit. As she examined utensils and trays, Agatha imagined the physical flow of the pudding from preparation to serving. The lattice carefully placed, the custard layered beneath, the final sprinkling of almonds, all seemed straightforward until she considered the placement of residues and the missing spoon. Each element suggested the pudding could have been accessed at multiple points, and she made a mental note of which opportunities were most plausible for tampering. Even amid the serious analysis, Agatha allowed herself to appreciate the cozy, familiar details of the kitchen, the warm sunlight glinting off copper pans, the faint aroma of vanilla lingering in the air, the playful notes and reminders pinned to cupboards. These small touches reminded her and the audience of the village's charm, even while danger lingered unseen. Humor and quaint domesticity softened the tension, balancing the suspense with the comforting rhythm of everyday life. By carefully aligning movements, timing, and interactions, Agatha began to see patterns emerge. Each discrepancy, each minor slip-up, each unusual glance or hesitation now fit together like pieces of a puzzle. The preparation, once a simple series of steps, now appeared as a potential pathway for deliberate interference. Her mind sketched multiple scenarios, weighing plausibility against opportunity, while keeping in mind the subtle foreshadowing embedded in villagers' behavior. As she stepped back, Agatha surveyed the reconstructed scene in her imagination, noting every detail: ingredients, utensils, timing, and human behavior. The pudding's journey from mixing bowl to serving dish was now clear, yet the precise moment of tampering remained elusive. She smiled faintly, aware that the solution was within reach, and that each small clue she had collected, the smudges, the missing spoon, the contradictions in stories, would soon converge into the revelation she anticipated. With the picture almost complete, Agatha was ready to move one step closer to uncovering the truth behind the fatal dessert. Chapter 6. The Red Herrings. Agatha surveyed the hall with a careful eye, noting the chatter and small gestures of the villagers. It was astonishing how quickly ordinary behavior could be mistaken for guilt, she mused, especially in a village as quaint and as peculiar as Carsley. Her investigations had already uncovered clues, but now the morning's chaos was producing a series of red herrings, each one as distracting as it was entertaining. Mr. Larkins, for example, wandered near the dessert table repeatedly, ostensibly adjusting chairs, though each time he leaned over, he emitted a faint sniff of cinnamon. Agatha observed him closely, pondering whether he had been involved in the pudding tampering or merely fussing with the pastries in his usual obsessive manner. His anxious glances toward Mrs. Tilling only added to the confusion, making it appear as though he were hiding something far more sinister than a mere concern for symmetry. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pritchard's exaggeratedly nervous behavior drew attention away from others. She muttered under her breath about missing teaspoons and crumbs, wringing her hands as if the fate of the village rested on her vigilance. Villagers whispered among themselves, some exchanging knowing looks, others shaking their heads at her fussiness. Agatha couldn't help but suppress a small smile. The woman's frantic energy made her appear far more culpable than her actions warranted. It was a perfect example of misdirection, a distracting flourish amid the true sequence of events. A minor mishap occurred when a tray of pastries tipped slightly as a child dashed past, sending a scattering of almond-topped buns skittering across the floor. Gasps and laughter erupted simultaneously, and several villagers' eyes darted toward the scene as though the small chaos were evidence of deliberate interference. Agatha noted the scene carefully. Crumbs and toppled pastries might seem significant, but the context revealed it was merely the result of youthful exuberance, not guilt. Still, the moment added another layer of confusion, nudging suspicion toward the wrong people. Even the stranger, who had lingered quietly since the beginning, contributed to the fog of uncertainty. He hovered near the windows, notebook in hand, pretending to sketch the autumn scenery. His presence, calm and composed, drew glances and speculation from everyone present. Agatha noted the contrast between his serene demeanor and the villagers' flustered anxiety. While some interpreted it as suspicious, she reminded herself that not all anomalies were clues. Sometimes human behavior was simply unpredictable. Amid the swirl of misdirection, Agatha observed subtler signs that could guide her toward the truth. Slight smudges on counters, faint traces of almond paste on the edge of a bowl, and inconsistencies in timing of movements were easily overlooked by casual observers, but stood out to her practiced eye. Each red herring, Mr. Larkin's cinnamon, Mrs. Pritchard's nervous muttering, the spilled pastries, was a distraction from these more meaningful details. Despite the tension, humor kept the atmosphere from becoming oppressive. A whispered comment about Mr. Larkin's perfumed obsession with symmetry prompted stifled giggles, while a small child's squeal as they chased a rolling bun caused more than one adult to stumble into a chair. Agatha allowed herself a moment of quiet amusement. The village's charm persisted, even amidst the swirl of suspicion and misdirection. By the end of the morning, Agatha had catalogued each false lead carefully. Every distraction had been considered, every eccentric behavior noted, and every humorous mishap logged as potential but misleading evidence. She knew that separating truth from these playful yet confounding clues was critical to solving the puzzle. With a patient, meticulous approach, she began to see beyond the chaos, ready to discern which paths were real and which were cleverly placed distractions in the web of deception surrounding the poisoned pudding. Agatha was leaning against the edge of the hall table, sipping a cup of tea and reviewing her notes, when a small, seemingly inconsequential comment caught her attention. Mrs. Tilling, who had been quietly rearranging leftover pastries, muttered to no one in particular, "I suppose I shouldn't have left the nutmeg near the sugar. Such carelessness can be costly." Her tone was mild, almost apologetic, and at first glance it seemed merely an expression of domestic frustration. But Agatha's sharp eyes and ears perked up. That was not a casual remark. It contained a thread worth following. She approached Mrs. Tilling with a gentle smile. "Did you say the nutmeg was left near the sugar?" she asked conversationally. Mrs. Tilling nodded, clearly unaware of the significance she had just revealed. "Yes, it was a small oversight. I placed it there while arranging the ingredients and went to fetch more cream. Nothing unusual, really." Agatha's mind raced. The placement of the nutmeg was curious, an opportunity for substitution or contamination, and aligned with the minor inconsistencies she had already noted in the pudding's preparation. Meanwhile, Mr. Henshaw, oblivious to the subtle revelation, was recounting the morning's events to a neighbor, emphasizing how he had adjusted the latticework of the pudding. His meticulous description inadvertently highlighted how many people had touched the dessert before it reached the table, reinforcing the possibility of interference during preparation. Agatha filed the details with precision, realizing that each innocent action, when viewed together, began to form a coherent pattern. A soft laugh from a child chasing a rolling bun across the hall reminded her that not all movement was suspicious, yet it provided contrast, the genuine chaos of playful energy versus the calculated movements that might indicate intent. Agatha noted both with equal care. Context was everything. Gestures, timing, and proximity could reveal as much as words themselves. By mid-afternoon, Agatha had pieced together several threads: the nutmeg placement, the missing teaspoon, and the minor smudges and residues that had puzzled her for hours. The revelation from Mrs. Tilling, combined with her prior observations, narrowed the field of suspects. The subtle misplacement of ingredients was no longer an idle oversight. It was a clue that someone had exploited opportunities in the kitchen, a calculated yet easily overlooked act. Agatha allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The pieces were falling into place. She could trace the sequence of preparation and identify points where tampering could occur. The villagers, meanwhile, remained engaged in light chatter, their quirks and mannerisms adding humor and charm to the scene. Mrs. Pritchard's dramatic sighs, Mr. Larkin's precise folding of napkins, even the child's occasional squeals, all contributed to the warm, cozy ambiance that contrasted with the gravity of the poisoning. It reminded Agatha that, despite danger, Carsley remained a village of character and gentle humor. With a few notes jotted and the key observation firmly lodged in her mind, Agatha began connecting behaviors, timing, and opportunity. Each innocuous comment and overlooked detail now held significance. The realization was subtle but powerful. Someone had used familiarity and trust within the kitchen to their advantage. Agatha could sense the culprit's identity beginning to emerge from the fog of red herrings, though she maintained her composure, letting the investigation unfold with patience. By the end of the afternoon, the hall seemed calm once more, but Agatha's thoughts were busy weaving together the strands of evidence. A seemingly minor revelation had transformed her understanding of the morning's events. The pieces were aligning, the field of suspects narrowing, and the web of secrets that had cloaked the pudding's preparation was slowly unraveling. Cozy warmth, gentle humor, and human eccentricity framed the unfolding suspense, making the discovery feel intimate and engaging rather than foreboding. Agatha was closer than ever to identifying the culprit, and the thrill of impending resolution danced quietly at the edge of her thoughts.
Chapter 7. The Confrontation. Agatha stood at the front of the village hall, a small notebook in hand and a calm, expectant expression on her face. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting warm squares of light across the wooden floor. One by one, the villagers arrived, their faces betraying curiosity, amusement, and just the faintest hint of anxiety. Mrs. Tilling fussed with her apron. Mr. Henshaw adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, and Mrs. Pritchard clutched her teacup with a tight grip. Even the quiet stranger leaned against the wall, arms crossed, observing the gathering with mild interest. Agatha began with a gentle smile,
her voice warm yet deliberate. "Thank you all for coming. I've spent the past few days observing, listening, and piecing together the events of our annual Hardest Tea. As you know, a serious incident occurred involving the legendary Carsley pudding, and it's time we understand exactly what happened." Her calm tone set the stage. There was no accusation yet, only a promise of clarity. She invited the villagers to sit in a semicircle, giving each a clear view of the others. "I'd like to recount what I've observed," she continued, "and perhaps we can untangle some inconsistencies along the way." Her words were carefully chosen, laced with subtle humor that immediately lightened the mood. After all, it's remarkable how a small spoon can create such drama, isn't it? A ripple of laughter passed through the group, easing the tension while sharpening their focus. Agatha began recounting the sequence of events, highlighting the preparation of the pudding. She described the careful layering of ingredients, the lattice work, and the placement of spices, paying attention to minute details. Villagers listened intently, some nodding, others fidgeting, all aware that their words and reactions might inadvertently reveal more than intended. Then she gently introduced the first discrepancies, mentioning missing utensils, misplaced ingredients, and minor contradictions in recollections. "Now, it's fascinating," she said, tilting her head with a wry smile, "how memory can be as unpredictable as a rolling bun. Some of our participants recall details quite differently from others. Wouldn't you agree?" She allowed the humor to linger, while her eyes subtly studied each person's reaction. She paused to look directly at Mr. Henshaw, who adjusted his tie nervously. "For instance, the cinnamon traces noted on the counter. How do we reconcile that with our earlier accounts?" His face reddened, and he shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that his meticulous habits had inadvertently drawn suspicion. Agatha's sharp observation, combined with her gentle teasing, made it clear she had noticed far more than anyone realized. Turning to Mrs. Pritchard and Mrs. Tilling, she pointed out slight inconsistencies in their statements, highlighting them with an understated charm rather than accusation. "And yet," she said, "it appears our careful movements and tiny oversights have provided an interesting puzzle, haven't they?" The villagers exchanged glances, whispers rippling through the room as the web of suspicion began to tighten. Finally, Agatha introduced the minor, seemingly trivial details: the child chasing a rolling bun, the smudged nutmeg jar, and the absent teaspoon. All the clues that might have been dismissed by a casual observer. She framed them with subtle wit, letting the villagers see that the investigation was both thorough and humane. Suspense built steadily as the audience and the villagers alike understood that a resolution was imminent, yet the precise culprit remained veiled. By the end of the gathering, everyone was attentive, alert, and slightly uneasy. Agatha's calm authority, combined with her gentle humor and keen observations, had created an environment where tension and anticipation coexisted with charm and amusement. The stage was perfectly set. The suspects were assembled, contradictions exposed, and the audience's curiosity primed for the revelation that would follow. Agatha cleared her throat and allowed a moment of silence to settle over the village hall. Every pair of eyes was fixed on her, curious, anxious, and slightly apprehensive. She folded her hands calmly, her expression warm but resolute. "It seems our little puzzle has been intriguing, hasn't it?" she began, her voice carrying a gentle authority. "And yet, as always, the truth, though subtle, is surprisingly straightforward." She gestured toward Mr. Henshaw, who shifted nervously in his chair. "The culprit had both opportunity and motive, and most importantly, left subtle traces that anyone observant could notice. The missing teaspoon, the misplacement of the nutmeg, and the minor smudges on the counter were not accidental. They pointed directly to someone who cared about presentation, but perhaps cared a little too much." Her eyes twinkled with humor, acknowledging his meticulous nature while keeping the atmosphere light.
Mr. Henshaw swallowed, glancing at Mrs. Tilling and Mrs. Pritchard as though seeking an ally. Agatha continued, describing how the pudding had been prepared and how access at multiple stages allowed for tampering. She traced the timeline with precision, outlining each interaction in the kitchen, the small opportunities for interference, and the exact moment when the dessert had been compromised. Villagers leaned forward, ears pricked, as her words tied together the subtle clues that had been floating unnoticed throughout the hall. The method was clever yet simple, Agatha explained. A small pinch of nutmeg, innocuous to most, was replaced with a finely ground substitute laced with a harmless but extremely bitter compound, enough to make a dramatic impression without causing lasting harm. A ripple of relief passed through the group as they realized no permanent danger had occurred. Agatha smiled, letting the tension ebb while maintaining the thrill of the revelation. The room was quiet for a heartbeat before murmurs of recognition and surprise began to spread. "It was you, Mr. Henshaw," whispered Mrs. Tilling, her eyes wide. Mr. Henshaw cleared his throat, eyes darting around the room, finally nodding sheepishly. I only meant to create a dramatic demonstration of caution," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I never intended anyone to get hurt. I simply wanted to highlight how careful one must be when working with such delicate recipes." Agatha's lips twitched with a small smile. "Intentions aside," she said, "the effects were real, and fortunately no serious harm occurred. But it does remind us how pride, rivalry, and a little overzealousness can complicate even the most charming village traditions." The villagers chuckled, easing the tension as they processed the revelation. The child who had chased the rolling bun clapped their hands in delight, and Mrs. Pritchard let out a dramatic sigh of relief, half laughing, half exasperated. Even Mr. Henshaw managed a sheepish smile, appreciating the gentle handling of his confession. Agatha's careful balance of humor and clarity had allowed the truth to emerge without embarrassment or fear, preserving the cozy charm of the village while resolving the mystery. Finally, she addressed the hall with a concluding note of warmth. "Let this be a lesson. Curiosity, observation, and a touch of humor often uncover the truth more effectively than confrontation or suspicion. And of course, Carsley pudding remains a treasured tradition, one that will undoubtedly be prepared with even greater care next year." Laughter rippled through the hall as villagers exchanged knowing smiles, the tension of the past days replaced by relief, amusement, and renewed community spirit. Agatha settled back into her chair, sipping a cup of tea and observing the lively chatter. The puzzle had been solved, motives revealed, and subtle clues connected. In the cozy warmth of Carsley, justice had been served without malice, and the village's charm, quaint, humorous, and ever observant, was preserved, leaving everyone with a satisfying sense of closure and anticipation for the next village adventure.
Chapter 8. A Village Restored. Agatha settled into her favorite armchair by the window, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. Outside, the late autumn sun cast a golden glow over Carsley's quaint cottages, and the rustle of fallen leaves stirred a gentle nostalgia. She allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, savoring the calm that had returned after the flurry of pudding-induced chaos. The village, with all its quirks and eccentricities, was slowly returning to its usual rhythm, and she felt a satisfying sense of closure. Her thoughts drifted to the events of the past few days, the subtle clues, the nervous glances, the humorous missteps, and, of course, the red herrings that had complicated the investigation. Agatha smiled, reflecting on the intricacies of village life, the delicate balance of pride, rivalry, and goodwill that could turn something as simple as a dessert into a mini-drama of almost operatic proportions. It was, she thought wryly, precisely why she loved Carsley. A gentle knock on the door drew her attention. It was Mrs. Tilling, carrying a small plate of freshly baked scones. "Thought you might like a little treat," she said with a warm smile. Agatha invited her in, and together they sat at the small kitchen table.
The aroma of butter and sugar mingled with the lingering scent of tea, comforting and familiar. Conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from minor village gossip to plans for the next harvest festival. As they spoke, Agatha reflected on the reconciliations that had taken place. Mr. Henshaw had apologized to the villagers for the unintended panic, and while a few eyebrows had been raised at his overzealousness, laughter had followed soon after. Mrs. Pritchard, ever dramatic, had been placated by assurances that her favorite spoon would never again be absent from a preparation, and even the child who had caused minor havoc with the rolling bun had been forgiven with gentle amusement. Carsley was settling back into its comforting pattern, its charm unbroken. Agatha sipped her tea thoughtfully, eyes scanning the familiar streets visible through the window. She noted the crisp air, the golden leaves, and the occasional flutter of curtains as villagers went about their afternoon routines. Cozy as the village was, she allowed herself a small, quiet anticipation for the future. Somewhere, behind some unsuspecting corner or within the folds of ordinary days, another mystery, or at least a minor mischief, was surely waiting to unfold. It was, she reminded herself, the unassuming suspense of everyday life that kept her senses sharp and her curiosity alive. Her gaze returned to Mrs. Tilling, who was describing a particularly amusing mishap with a misplaced spoon during the pudding preparation. Agatha laughed softly, the sound blending with the warm, golden light of the room. These small domestic details, the clatter of dishes, the gentle aroma of baked goods, and the warmth of tea reminded her why solving mysteries was enjoyable, but why living in Carsley was infinitely more delightful. Each character, each eccentricity, each whispered comment from the hallways contributed to a tapestry of charm and humor that was uniquely the village's. As the afternoon waned, Agatha felt a satisfying sense of completeness. The investigation had been thorough, the culprit exposed, and the village restored to its familiar rhythm. She reflected on the importance of observation, patience, and empathy, realizing that even in a quaint community, every small act carried weight, and every tiny clue could illuminate truth. With a final sip of tea, she smiled, content in the knowledge that peace, laughter, and the comforting quirks of village life would continue, at least for now, until the next delightful disturbance.
The village hall was alive with laughter and clinking teacups as Carsley gathered once more, this time in celebration rather than suspense. Tables were adorned with autumnal decorations, golden leaves intertwined with sprigs of rosemary, and platters of scones, cakes, and pies created a tempting aroma that filled the cozy space. Agatha moved among the villagers, accepting nods and smiles, her presence a quiet anchor of composure amid the cheerful bustle. Mrs. Pritchard, still theatrical in her expressions, was recounting the earlier pudding chaos with exaggerated gestures, earning giggles from the children and knowing glances from neighbors. Agatha watched, amused, as Mr. Henshaw sheepishly attempted to help by serving tea, spilling just enough to provoke laughter without causing real mishap. Even minor accidents, like a toppled plate of biscuits, added charm to the scene, turning small blunders into collective amusement. Agatha's eyes drifted to the hall's corners, noting the subtle restoration of Carsley's social rhythm. Friends who had been cautious or wary during the investigation were now chatting freely, toasting their glasses and recounting the day's events with light-hearted exaggeration. The nervous tension that had hung over the village like fog was replaced with camaraderie, and the warmth of shared relief was almost tangible. Villagers teased one another gently about small rivalries, and laughter bubbled throughout the room, a testament to community bonds resilient to even the most alarming incidents. She made her way to the long table where the desserts were displayed. The famed Carsley pudding, now safely enjoyed under careful supervision, was accompanied by other treats that had somehow survived the previous chaos. Agatha appreciated the little quirks, the slightly crooked latticework on a tart, the uneven frosting on a cake, reminders that imperfections only added character. As she sampled a slice of her own, the sweet, comforting flavors reminded her why these small gatherings were cherished, even when drama arose. Across the hall, children played quietly near a stack of cushions, their laughter punctuating the low murmur of adult conversations. Agatha's gaze lingered on them for a moment, considering the rhythms of village life and how easily small events could ripple outward, creating unexpected consequences. A subtle smile touched her lips, recognizing that, while the mystery was resolved, life in Carsley would continue to provide small puzzles, moments of intrigue, and tiny adventures waiting just around the corner. As the afternoon wore on, Agatha raised her teacup gently, drawing attention without formality to the community of Carsley for resilience, humor, and an uncanny ability to turn even the most alarming events into opportunities for laughter and reflection. May our traditions continue with care, our friendships grow stronger, and our curiosities remain ever keen. The hall echoed with light applause, soft laughter, and the clinking of glasses, a chorus of reassurance and goodwill. She allowed herself a quiet satisfaction, reflecting on the investigation's resolution and the restored harmony, yet her mind lingered on small, unanswered questions: the slightly smudged nutmeg jar, the curious placement of a teaspoon, the fleeting glances exchanged during the tea. These details, trivial to some, whispered of future intrigues, subtle mysteries awaiting her attention. Agatha sipped her tea, relishing the comfort of resolution while savoring the anticipation of the unknown. The sun dipped low, casting a warm, amber glow through the hall windows. Villagers continued to chat, laugh, and share food, the gentle chaos of friendship and community filling the space. Agatha looked around, content in the knowledge that Carsley's heart, its people, their quirks, and their stories remained as charming and resilient as ever, and while today's puzzle was solved, she knew, with quiet excitement, that tomorrow would undoubtedly bring another small adventure, another cozy mystery to unravel, and another day in the life of Carsley to cherish.